so revered by the British that in the 1950s, a statue is raised to him in Parliament Square. My great-grandfather was the only man to sign the peace treaties after both World Wars. He was father of the Royal Air Force, central to the creation of the League of Nations, and drafted the preamble to the United Nations Charter. He was Prime Minister of South Africa twice, and Albert Einstein held him to be one of only 10 people who truly understood the theory of relativity. But Jan Smuts was also a white supremacist who supported racial segregation in South Africa. Moral narratives shift, and Smuts falls out of the history books, at least until the summer of 2020, when anti-racist campaigners, having thrown a statue of Edward Colston into Bristol Harbour, turned to the statue of Jan Christian Smuts in Parliament Square. So that's just to give a bit of context. But to understand Jan Smuts and his strange contradictions, you have to place him in his time. He was born in 1870 in the Northern Cape Colony, which was part of the British Empire. His parents were well-to-do Afrikaner families, farmers, and his world was one of deeply entrenched racial hierarchies. Slavery had been abolished only 3 decades earlier in the Cape Colony, and labour remained very stratified, with people of colour doing all the physical work. It was also 30 years since the Great Trek, when the Voortrekkers left the Cape in outrage at the British abolishing slavery and colonised the interior, creating the Transvaal and Orange Free State. As the second son, Jan was destined to work the farm while his older brother received a formal education. But in 1882, when he was 12, his older brother Michael died suddenly of typhoid, and he was sent to school in his place. So he's 12 when he gets there, but within 3 years, he'd overtaken his schoolmates who had up to 10 years of formal education behind them. He was not only intelligent, but he had a thirst for information, for education, a prodigious memory, and incredible stamina. And in 1886, he matriculated 3rd on the Cape list. When we were growing up, there was this story which was told of how a week before the exam, he discovered that he should have been studying Greek. So he shut himself away and crammed for the exam for 6 days straight and came top in the whole of the Cape Colony, which this story turned out to be true. In 1891, he was awarded an Ebden scholarship to study at Cambridge. I'm always surprised by this move because he comes from an Afrikaner family and he comes and lives in the UK for 4 lonely years, but he did form some lasting connections, and I think it laid the foundations for an Anglophilic future. But when he returned to South Africa in 1895, he entered a society on the brink of upheaval. The discovery of gold in the Transvaal in 1886 had drawn thousands of outsiders to the Boer republics, stoking tensions with the British Empire. Since 1883, the Transvaal had been led by an old patriarch called Paul Kruger, who was very representative of what the Voortrekkers had become: Calvinist, fundamentalist, isolated. They saw themselves as God's chosen people. And meanwhile, at the Cape, Rhodes was dreaming of painting the map of Africa red from the Cape to Cairo. Labour was also becoming a central concern. How could Europeans force Africans who were living in reserves and on locations near white towns to work on white farms and in the mines? And how could whites get their hands on land in African reserves? In 1894, the Glen Grey Act, a major plank in what will later become apartheid, sets aside areas for exclusively African development and introduced enforced segregation, further disenfranchisement, and greater control of African economic options. And it justified the idea of a white South Africa. The Afrikaner historian, whose name's Herman, I can't pronounce his surname, Gilame, he says segregation developed in South Africa by marrying an economic system based primarily on migrant labor and a political system that ruled out black competition. Nevertheless, in the late 1890s, the Cape Colony still can't get its hands on the money that's coming out of the gold mines on the Witwatersrand. Jan Smuts, he's not a Voortrekker, he's a Cape Afrikaner, but when Rhodes tried to force an armed rebellion in the Transvaal, he, along with all the other Cape Afrikaners, felt totally betrayed. He gave up his British nationality and he moved to Johannesburg to try his luck as a lawyer in 1897. And meanwhile, the English speakers wanted the Transvaal immediately annexed, and British newspapers were fomenting anti-Boer sentiment. So that's where Jan comes from. He's a product of the late 19th century when overt racism was entirely acceptable amongst whites, and he was both a proud Afrikaner and the result of the British education system. In the Transvaal, his legal and political career flourished, and during the Anglo-Boer War, he proved himself a brilliant soldier, leading commandos on daring missions. But within a few years of the war's end, which was, as you all know, it was won by the British, and the Afrikaners were left feeling very bitter. But within a few years of the end, he was negotiating with the British for self-rule. I'd just like to move sideways a little bit here and talk about Quaker influence and internationalism, because around this time, he's in his mid-30s and he forms a life-changing friendship, which helped to transform him from an Afrikaner to an international figure and also deepen the contradictions in his attitudes. So through Emily Hobhouse, who was an English campaigner for better conditions in the concentration camps of the Boer War, he met a young English Quaker called Margaret Clark. And I'll just read a bit from the book here. The pair share a ship to England in early 1906 and discover the mutual admiration that spawns a letter a week for 40 years and Jan's deeper association with England. He visits Margaret Clark's family in Somerset and attends Quaker meeting with them, finding this quiet rural England with its sober nonconformist friends, as Quakers call each other, more charming than aristocratic circles in London. This England appeals to him, the England of John Bright, Margaret Clark's grandfather, the great reforming Liberal MP, instrumental in the repeal of the Corn Laws. It's very interesting that across 5,000 miles and very different national identities, there's quite a lot of sympathy between the educated Afrikaner, with he wore very plain clothes and he'd had a Calvinist upbringing, and the sober Quaker belief in hard work, social activity, and the life of the spirit. One historian says, this fortuitous encounter with the Quakers in 1906 revealed his true destiny to him. It was a haven where the main forces in his life coalesced. He adopted silent worship, even if he was unable to entirely accept their pacifist beliefs. In many ways, Margaret, who was my great aunt, I think, became his English family, and later his daughter, Jan Smuts, married her nephew, Bancroft Clark, and those are my grandparents. So that cemented the connection between him and the Quakers and England, and it also enabled my existence. So while he's negotiating with the British government over the future of the Boer republics, he's also deepening his relationship with nonconformist Britain. Thanks largely to his efforts, the South African republics are given self-governing status just 4 years after the Anglo-Boer War. In February 1907, Smuts's Het Volk party wins a landslide in the Transvaal elections, and he becomes both education and colonial secretary. 18 months later, in 1908, he drafts the constitution for a new united South Africa. And I'm going to read from the book again. How much of the blame for what happens later can therefore be placed on him provides endless material for historians. For a supplicant like me, it represents a potential nexus of shame, but for others, I find it is a nexus of pride. Instead of 4 tin pot countries, South Africa gathers into one mighty nation run along Westminster lines. But a federalized structure might have been better suited to these fractious states. And in this constitution, with its need to appeal to the race-obsessed Boer republics, only the Cape keeps a non-racial franchise. Cape politician William Schreiner, Olive Schreiner's younger brother, remarks that enshrining the division between people of different colours in the constitution is to build a grand building upon unsound and sinking foundations. And even Jan's first biographer, Keith Hancock, notes his career-long habit of letting the native problem, as they call it, drift because of the difficulties of dealing with it and all the deadly results this habit dragged in its wake. What might have happened, Hancock asked, if he had put his mind to this problem? So they've got this new country, but it's not an easy one to manage. In the post-Anglo-Boer War recession, poor whites were really struggling to rebuild their homes or find jobs. With few prospects, they flooded into towns and cities, only to find those towns also full of Africans who'd previously been hidden on farms and reserves. And they were working in factories and mines for half as much as the white population were. but black and white began mixing in what was thought to be a dangerous way, living in poverty on the edges of towns. So in 1911, the government limits the range of jobs to whites only. And in 1913, the government of which my great-grandfather is part passes the Natives Land Act, which divides land between black and white. So black Africans, who are 80% of the population, could only live on less than 10% of the land. This act was only repealed in 1991, and it's part of a ribbon of legislation that unfurls into apartheid, leading to homelands, influx control, pass laws, and the Group Areas Act. So that's Smuts, that's where he comes from, the forces shaping him. But in 1914, with the First World War, he steps onto an international political stage, and one that he doesn't leave until his death in 1950. Just over a decade after fighting against the British, he fought for them in the First World War, commanding troops across Africa before leaving for London in 1917. Here he joined the Imperial War Cabinet, where, amongst other high-level roles, he reviews the air services, which become the RAF. And after the war, in 1919, he joins his Prime Minister, Louis Botha, at the Paris Peace Conference. Throughout the war, Jan's been looking to the future, and he viewed the establishment of a League of Nations as a primary goal of this conference. In December 1918, he presented the Imperial War Cabinet with what Richard Steyn calls an intellectually brilliant paper, bringing together in 21 propositions his synthesis of three concepts: imperialism, Commonwealth, and a League of Nations, which supported Woodrow Wilson's efforts to counter American isolationist tendencies. This was issued as a pamphlet called The League of Nations, a practical suggestion, and it was very well received, and Wilson rewrote his proposals based on it. According to Mark Maus, I can't pronounce this historian either, according to Mark Mazawa, Jan had now become one of the leading theorists of international order. His proposals included the creation of a Council of the Great Powers as permanent members and a non-permanent selection of the minor states. He also proposed the creation of a mandate system for captured colonies of the Central Powers during the war. Jan Smuts saw the League as necessary in unifying white internationalists and pacifying a race war through indirect rules by Europeans over non-whites. And Cripps states that the League of Nations mandate system reflected a compromise between Smuts's desire to annex non-white territories and Woodrow Wilson's principles of trusteeship. So the League of Nations was more universal and inclusive in its membership and structure than previous international organizations, but it did enshrine racial hierarchy by curtailing the right to self-determination and prevented decolonization. The interwar years. After signing the Treaty of Versailles, which he regarded as a death sentence on Europe, his ship docked at Cape Town in August 1919. And days later, Prime Minister Botha was dead. And by the 3rd of September, Jan was in Cape Town, ready to shoulder responsibility for the nation, age 49. He led South Africa from September 1919 until 1924. He ruled with a rod of iron, and as well as being Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, took on the Ministry of Native Affairs. This made it seem as if he was the government, and he was blamed for the dire economic situation, as well as being a target for Afrikaners who were virulently opposed to being part of the British Empire. He, in contrast, saw South Africa's future as a small and geographically remote country, as part of and protected by that empire. Jan's attitude towards non-whites in his country was mixed. Under his premiership, 2 massacres of non-white South Africans occurred. The Bullhoek massacre of 1921, when 163 members of an indigenous religious sect were killed, and the Bondelswartz rebellion of 1922, when 100 Khoi were killed. This was internationally condemned and investigated under the new League of Nations mandate system. But on the other hand, in opposition, in 1925, he objected to the industrial colour bar on the mines. He said, "We are going to declare to the natives, you shall in future be debarred from rising above the level of hewers of wood and drawers of water. I am all for the white man, but there is something in my breast that cannot stand this." And he fruitlessly, unfortunately, suggested a system to safeguard white domination while allowing some blacks to climb the social hierarchy, a non-racial franchise based on wealth and income. But he does fail time after time to address the problem that he accepts is always going to be the most significant facing South Africa, and he actively makes it worse. I'm going to quote from W.E.B. Du Bois now, who in 1925 said, Jan Smuts is today, in his world aspects, the greatest protagonist of the white race. He is fighting to take control of Lorenzo Marx from a nation that recognizes, even though it does not realize, the equality of black folk. He is fighting to keep India from political and social equality in the empire. He is fighting to ensure the continued and eternal subordination of black to white in Africa. And he is fighting for peace and goodwill in a white Europe, which can by union present a united front to the yellow, brown, and black worlds. In all this, he expresses bluntly, and yet not without finesse, what a powerful host of white folk believe, but do not plainly say, in Melbourne, New Orleans, San Francisco, Hong Kong, Berlin, and London. Du Bois has a point, I think. It's not necessarily that Jan's more racist than others, although he might well be, but the nature of South African society makes it really hard to hide your hypocrisy. As the white world is turning towards ideals of equality in the post-world era, paying lip service to change is relatively straightforward. For Europe, there's not very many people of color at this point living in Europe. And for Australia, Canada, the northern United States, and for New Zealand, which have exterminated most of the native populations and are quietly assimilating or sequestering the remainder. Meanwhile, white Europeans benefit from African labor and raw materials through colonies and later neocolonial power. And in South America, with its mixed population, things are more subtle still. But in South Africa and the deep south of the United States, even incremental change is difficult. Both have sizable populations of both black and white, raised in a society where the white man is the master and the black man is the servant. To achieve equity here, whites must give up their power, their privilege, who they think they are. And in both places, they resist and white supremacy takes root, a virulent controlling racism. Moving on to the Second World War, when Britain declared war on Germany in 1939, many Afrikaners didn't want to fight on the same side as the British, and quite a lot of them actually slithered towards the Nazi camp. And even Prime Minister Herzog wanted to remain neutral. But Jan Smuts argued strenuously for joining the British, and when Parliament voted, he won, becoming Prime Minister again, and South Africa entered the Second World War for the Allies. He travelled for months each year during this war, and he was consulted by Churchill, Eisenhower, and others, and he was appointed Field Marshal in the British Army in 1941. In the South African general election of 1943, he won a huge victory. It was to be his last. And then we get to the United Nations. In May 1945, Jan represents South Africa at the San Francisco conference. Anthony Eden called him the doyen of the conference, quite unrivaled in intellectual attributes and unsurpassed in experience and authority. But his hypocrisy did not go unnoticed at home or abroad. The historian I mentioned earlier, Mark Mazawa, credits Smuts as being instrumental in shaping the UN's stirring preamble, noting that he did more than anyone to argue for and help draft its final form. Smuts envisaged the UN as a mechanism to preserve white imperial rule over Africa, which influenced his initial drafting of the preamble. His original opening lines, echoing the League of Nations covenant, read, "The high contracting parties, determined to prevent a recurrence of the fratricidal strife which twice in our generation has brought untold sorrow and loss upon mankind." However, at the conference, significant revisions were made, and in particular, the Soviet delegates demanded the inclusion of language addressing equal rights and the self-determination of peoples, which marked a turning point, leading to a preamble that emphasized human rights and reflected broader aspirations for equality. I think it's important to remember at this point that Jan was 76 and he was very out of step with the general feeling at the UN, where many, especially the Indians, did not like the social separation of races in South Africa, whereas he felt that South Africa was misunderstood. And he wrote to his English Quaker friend, Margaret Clark, "But South Africans cannot understand. Colour bars are to them part of the divine order of things. I sometimes wonder what our position in years to come will be when the whole world will be against us." While Jan Smuts is remembered for his contributions to international cooperation, his work also reveals the tensions underlying the founding of the UN. As a premier of white-ruled South Africa, he embodied the contradictions in international law. The pursuit of the common good was often entangled with self-interest. The inclusion of human rights in the Charter was later imbued with a more inclusive meaning, this shift owing much to the efforts of the emerging global community, particularly voices from the developing world. The evolution of human rights at mid-century reflects both their universal promise and the darker legacies of imperialism. Meanwhile, industrialization in post-war South Africa increased the number of urban blacks, white anxieties about vanishing in the Black Sea, as the National Party's Milan put it, rose. And in 1948, Jan Smuts lost a general election to the National Party and apartheid was ushered in. He died 2 years later in 1950. Legacy. For some, Jan Smuts remains a legitimate hero, a South African statesman surpassed only by Nelson Mandela on this world stage and relatively untainted by the spectre of apartheid. A globally renowned statesman and a key architect of both the League of Nations and the United Nations, he holds the unique distinction of signing the charters of both organizations. However, despite his accomplishments, Jan Smuts remains an ambiguous and at times contradictory figure. While he was celebrated during his lifetime, particularly in Britain and the Commonwealth, he faced sharp criticism within South Africa. Afrikaner nationalists derided him as the handyman of empire, while white workers saw him as the lackey of capitalism. And during the apartheid era, his legacy faded into relative obscurity. Beyond South Africa, his overt belief in white supremacy and refusal to acknowledge the black majority as equal citizens severely tarnished his reputation in later generations. His philosophy of holism, which was presented in his 1926 book, Holism and Evolution, sought to emphasize interconnectedness, but it was undermined by his failure to apply it within South Africa. The very union he proposed, the Union of South Africa, his first holistic enterprise, was designed exclusively as a white union, excluding the majority population. And this glaring inconsistency remains a significant flaw in his legacy, underscoring his inability to extend his ideals to the people of color under his leadership. I'm just going to end by reading from Moederland and thinking about how this global story intersects with my own small personal one. My family's confused relationship with imperial power appears on film in footage from November 1956, which shows my mother as a teenager staring up in silent black and white at a newly unveiled statue of her grandfather in Parliament Square, alongside her mother and sisters. The British Pathé newsreel shows seated ranks of dignitaries and Clementine Churchill in place of her indisposed husband. The bronze statue, designed by Jacob Epstein, has Smuts in his army uniform, leaning slightly forward, arms behind his back like some ice skating general. Already in 1956, Margaret Gillett is questioning the wisdom of raising a statue to Smuts when South Africa is engaged in anti-British ferment. Smuts's biographer, Keith Hancock, writes to her, "Your reference to the Jameson raid and the Prime Minister hit the situation exactly to my mind. It's an appalling world to put up a statue. I think Churchill is very well advised in getting out of his function in the ceremony." Despite this rocky start, the statue stands peacefully in Parliament Square for over half a century, held in high enough regard by some that they repaint it green in 2017. But in June 2020, campaigners in Bristol, the city where I live, inflamed by the murder of George Floyd by police officers in the United States, pulled down the statue of 17th century slave trader Edward Colston and stand on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds in memory of George Floyd before throwing him in the harbour. Black Lives Matter gains momentum, and I'm watching it unfold on the television when my phone pings and my brother, or his WhatsApp avatar, reports in a few tight words, "Smuts in Parliament Square just called out on Channel 4 News." I find it almost straight away as the algorithms kick in, on fire tonight with Black Lives Desperately Mattering, www.toppletheracist.org, and I click on that and zoom in on the tiny map and tap the blue pin and up it comes. London, Jan Smuts statue, Parliament Square. Jan Smuts was the instigator of segregation and apartheid in South Africa and is commemorated by a statue in Parliament Square just across from the statue of Nelson Mandela, who devoted his life to tearing down the racist institutions Smuts built. There it is. 3 miles from where I sit, the statue of Edward Colston lies at the bottom of Bristol Harbour. The currents of history are strong and tug at the neck of statues. I know a statue is not alive, just hollow space representing a man, and that the man himself has died. I calculate slowly, 70 years ago. But still, I hope he is not pulled down, rope around his neck, a lynching, a retribution. It is all very personal. Guilt, shame, and pride percolate. I do not hold the scales of justice. My knowledge is small and occluded, and I struggle to understand what I think. On the one hand, the creation of the League of Nations, his unflagging work towards defeating Hitler, the preamble to the United Nations Charter, which surely continues to resonate as a force for good, millions helped. On the other, irreparable damage caused to entire African societies, millions of lives ruined. But this balance sheet is a red herring. A murderer would not be found not guilty just because he was a life-saving medical doctor. I think about guilt and collective responsibility, about the great man problem, which is related to the statue problem, how a great man does not come from nowhere, has roots and influences and stands inside a society or a tradition, how the whole idea of a great man allows such a person to become unmoored from their society so that all the pride, all the blame rests on their shoulders alone. A crime as big as apartheid is not the act of one man, it is a collective act, and white women are part of that collective, no matter how oppressed themselves. I think about the history of such a crime, the prehistory, cause and effect, all the footsteps we have traced across the South African landscape. When one person becomes shorthand for a whole system, this allows the system to go underground. In short, pulling down one statue is not enough. Yet it is a start, a digging away at the foundations, the opposite, I think, of the whitewashing it is accused of being. When these statues rest in place as if no crime was committed, as if they are a pure source of pride, surely that is whitewashing history, both making it white and cleansing it of sin. This is not a matter of identity politics, which too often strip away the complex reality of what it means to wake up human every morning. After all, human beings live among the weeds, that straggling, dirty place of feelings, opportunity, self-delusion, misunderstanding, self-interest, altruism. It is an examining, a careful moral reckoning, so that, in the words of the preamble to the United Nations Charter, signed by my flawed, brilliant great-grandfather, we, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women. Thank you.